Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday, little BookTube ritual where we read poetry on Thursday. Some of us do, very few of us do. And mine has turned into the kind of psychodrama that always ends up happening on this channel, where I'm going through one book, this big, heavy anthology, 20th century American poetry, which has always been a kind of a shorthand bugaboo for me of saying 20th century American poetry has always been synonymous for me with when poetry died, when poetry stopped being a genre for ordinary readers. I knew when I said that, I've known all along when I've said that huge chunks of the 20th century aren't like that there has been great poetry in the 20th century. I've loved 5 or 6 great 20th century American poets. And one of them in more ways than one. And I have been connected with 20th century poetry. I know that some of it is really good, but some of it is also awful, and it is also where a philosophical shift happened in the nature of what we consider to be poetry that removed it from popular concerns, removed it from the popular sphere. So I went into this with a bit of trepidation. This is a chronological thing, big, compendious thing, really, really good anthology. I decided pretty early on that I'm going to devote the rest of 2023's Poetry Thursdays to this book, to reading through this book. This will not be a long entry, because today's entry for Poetry Thursday is illustrating a danger that you run into with anthologies of any kind. Whenever you're doing an anthology, even if it's an academic anthology, can we see the Norton Critical Anthology of the Oxford Book of World Literature or whatever? Some of those are, the editorial board, the picking board is a large community of scholars. But in this case, it's 3 people. Yeah, it's 3 editors here. And when you get 3 editors, 2 editors, especially 1 editor, you're at the mercy of their visions, their quirks. They're going to do a big anthology like this, 20th century American poetry. You're going to know who they have to include. There's going to be a list of 20 names that they have to include. It's only... This thing was made before, this thing was made in 2004. That's 10 years before the institutional capture of academia. Academia started to fall around 2014. Around 2016 or 17, it had fallen completely. It was completely institutionally captured. And now, when you make a poetry anthology like this, your specific goal is not to include those 20 names that you have to include. Your specific goal is to omit them completely, or if the backers of the book won't give you permission, then grudgingly 1 poem. And you will go out of your way to pick a bad poem in order to give the impression for your brainwashed young readers that that poet is bad. And we all know the lines along which that censorship is happening. That poet is deemed to be bad because that poet is male, white, American. All of the very fashionable bigotries that have just taken over. They've been completely mainstreamed and normalized, so that you will have people, including YouTubers who are talking to a public, including booktubers who are supposed to care about books, say things like men can't write, white people can't write. And unfortunately, it's not just YouTubers and booktubers, it's also editors. So a 2023 version of a book like this, you wouldn't have that backstop of 20 to 25 names that you absolutely have to include. But this one still does. So these editors are going to know that there's a skeleton already in place, a canonical skeleton for their book. Fine. Great. Every editor knows that. Every editor used to know that. Before 2015, 2016, thereabouts, every editor knew that. But that leaves a lot of room. In a book this size, that leaves a lot of room. And so in an anthology of any kind, no matter what it is, you're going to get weird little flights of fancy. You're going to get weird little idiosyncrasies on the part of the editors. And the kind of forced checkbox fake diversity that is the cornerstone of the institutional capture that happened in the world in around 2014, that hadn't yet achieved lockstep. It wasn't yet institutionalized. In other words, the people who were doing the hiring and firing weren't yet zealots. They were ordinary people. But there were still zealots there who wanted to burn the whole thing down, as booktubers themselves have said, burn the whole thing down and build it all over again because your grandparents were horrible people. And I don't know which of those is governing the poet that we're talking about today, or maybe both are. Because the poet that we're talking about today does not belong in this book. Because the poet that we're talking about today is not an American poet. The poet is Yone Noguchi, born in 1875, died in 1947, born in Japan, educated in Japan, came to literary prominence and skill, learned his craft in Japan, wrote a large number of works in Japan, retired in Japan to literary esteem in Japan, was buried in Japan, and spent fewer than 10 years in America. Came to America, spent fewer than 10 years here, met a couple of American poets, throughout his whole life thought that very interesting things were being done in American poetry, but was an entirely Japanese figure. To say that this particular author is an American poet, to put him in an anthology of 20th century American poetry, you might as well say that Charles Dickens was an American novelist. Dickens spent just about exactly the same amount of time cumulatively in America as Noguchi did. In other words, there's no way to say it. So either, very little is included in here, so we don't have much to worry about. I'll read you a couple of poems because they're very short. Either this is an example of one of these editors just having a fascination with Noguchi and wanting him to be in this anthology, and I don't currently have a job editing a Japanese poetry anthology, so I'll stick him in here because he did once set foot on American soil. Either it's that, the whim of an editor, or it's the earliest faint flickerings of the coming institutional capture, which is that we don't have enough people here of Asian descent. We don't care about what's in the book or whether or not its presence there makes any sense. We are looking at a checkbox of immutable physical characteristics that don't have anything to do with the art or skill of the writer. In a 2023 anthology, that measuring line will be everything. The art and skill of the writer won't be considered at all. And in editorial meetings, if someone brings up, well, shouldn't we be estimating the art and skill of the writer involved as well as all of those progressive stack immutable characteristics? They will be called a colonialist. They will be called a racist. They will say to ask about quality is a racist position. That's the full flower of it. Is this the first flickering of it? I have no idea. I do not understand how to understand the presence of Yone Noguchi in this book. That's what I'm trying to say. But the poems are very short. We don't have, not every Poetry Thursday has to be very long. So let's see what we can find here. How about some hokus, as they're called in this book? Suppose the stars fall and break. Do they ever sound like my own love song? Or there's another one here about bells. Yes, look at, oh, how cool the sound of the bell that leaves the bell itself. It was a kind of a Taoist impenetrability there that I kind of like. It's not much. They're ditties. I'm sure that this author wrote greater things, and maybe the reason why those greater things are not in this book is because probably they were written in Japanese. Probably they were written during the 60 years that this author spent in Japan without giving a single thought to America in any way. Maybe that's the case, and maybe whichever editor crammed this author in here thought, well, that's a bridge too far. I'll include a couple of these things, but I can't include a longer work that, you know, I'm translating from the Japanese that has nothing to do with American poetry at all. I don't know. I'll never know unless I meet one of these people in an Uber, something like that. But that's it for today. It's a very, very brief Poetry Thursday because there's not much to it. It's a poet who should not have been included in this volume. So we'll spin the wheel. We're going forward with the table of contents. We'll see what we get to next time. I would imagine just in the rough idea of a chronological creep here, I would imagine that since we've done Robert Frost, that we're not far from Carl Sandburg. But who knows? Who knows? At this rate, if this guy can be stuck in here, then who knows? Some of the other people can be. We shall see. We will reconvene next Thursday and see what we make of it. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.